smooth, and it was, you know, they had done it before. They knew exactly what they were doing, and everything was done fair, and it was quick, and it just worked. I mean, it really did. I think it's a wonderful thing. I really do. I mean,
if you're in need of our services, feel free to call our offices, 303-534-3872. Visit our website, though. You'll find lots of information there. If you need help in any way, though, contact our office. We can take you through the application process step by step and explain every step as we take it going forward throughout the program.
Welcome to the Safety, Housing, Education, and Homelessness Committee of Denver City Council. The Safety, Housing, Education, and Homelessness Committee begins now.
Everyone, it is Wednesday, June 29th, 2022. You've reached the Denver City Council Safety Committee. We deal with issues related to safety, education, health, housing, and homelessness. Today's focus is on housing. Before we get into that, my name is Paul Cashman. I represent South Denver District 6 on City Council. I have the pleasure of chairing this committee. Before we get into our day's presentation, we'll start with introductions, and I'm going to start on my far right this time.
Good morning, Amanda Sawyer, District 5, and welcome back.
Good morning, Kevin Flynn, Southwest Denver District 2.
Good morning, Robin Kanich, at large.
Well, again, good morning, everyone. Our subject for today is a briefing on the affordable housing prioritization policy. I want to welcome a former member of our council family, currently with host Polly Kyle, who's going to give us that presentation. Polly, you take it away.
Thank you. Great to be back. Good to see all of you. I'm Polly Kyle. I'm the Housing Policy Officer with the Department of Health and Stability, and today we're going to talk about the Affordable Housing Prioritization Policy. So first, we'll just do a recap. What is HOST? We are focused on being healthy, housed, and connected. We were formed by an executive order in the fall of 2019. We brought housing and homelessness resolution together. We invest in resources, create policy, and partner to provide housing stability, resolve episodes of homelessness, and create housing opportunities. We have a lot of 2022 priorities. Today we're focusing on that last one, advance critical policies that increase affordable housing supply and address involuntary displacement, such as the prioritization policy. So citywide, rents and mortgages are increasing dramatically, and incomes are not keeping up. Today, more than 115,000, or 1 in 3, Denver households are housing cost burdened, meaning they spend more than a third of their income on housing alone, and this puts them at risk of losing their homes. As Denver has experienced growth, residents in previously affordable neighborhoods have become susceptible to involuntary displacement. When an area experiences gentrification, neighborhoods may experience both positive and negative neighborhood impacts. And while increasing property values may benefit some, they force residents and businesses out of the area, which is called involuntary displacement. Our community has told us time and again that involuntary displacement of residents is a growing and major area of concern. Throughout the development of other affordable housing plans and policies, including HOST's 5-year strategic plan and the expanding housing affordability policy, the need for policy to address involuntary displacement has been raised repeatedly. To address this, HOST is proposing a prioritization policy that would provide households at risk of or who have been displaced from their neighborhood or from Denver priority access to newly developed or preserved affordable housing. Our goal for the prioritization policy in Denver is to help residents at risk of displacement remain in and help residents who have been displaced return to their neighborhoods and to Denver generally in affordable homes. People who are likely to benefit are those who have long-standing deep ties and deep roots to the Denver community, or they're struggling to keep up with housing costs, such as facing foreclosure or paying more than 40% of their income on housing. They need to move because they're losing their housing through no fault of their own, such as a no-cause eviction, or renters who must move because property owners are selling or have sold the unit. So a quick rundown of how it'll work, and then we'll get into the details. Residents can sign up for notifications about affordable housing opportunities that meet their needs on a new user-friendly website. This website's intended to support all affordable housing, new affordable housing in Denver, as well as those prioritized units. Property managers and developers will post affordable rental vacancies and new for sale opportunities on the site. Units subject to the policy would be available for 14 days for residents to express interest. Property managers would prioritize residents at risk of or who have been displaced who express interest in the home. And if the resident meets the other requirements for the home, they could lease or buy the unit. So what's included? Affordable rental units. The policy is going to apply to new and newly preserved affordable housing rental units and would include city-regulated units. The city regulates units that receive city funds, are required through policy, such as mandatory housing, or negotiated agreements with the city. The policy is going to apply to mandatory housing when the building is a minimum of 100 units or any size building in an area vulnerable to displacement. The requirements would apply to initial lease-ups and subsequent lease-ups of vacant units for the affordability period of the rental development. For home ownership units, the policy would apply again to newly built affordable home ownership units and would include those city-regulated units, so city funds required through policy or negotiated agreements with the city. The policy only applies when the development is 10 units or more, and the policy requirements will only apply to first sales and not to subsequent sales. 30% of the units in qualifying developments will be set aside for the prioritization. The legal standard for determining the percentage of units the policy applies to must be rationally related to the incidence of involuntary displacement. To determine a rationally related standard, HOST reviewed existing data on housing needs and the prevalence of involuntary displacement. Like I said earlier, 115,000 households, or 35% of all households in Denver, are experiencing housing cost burden, which is a primary indicator of housing instability. Additionally, 30% of the city, county, Denver renters reported experiencing displacement as identified in the Metro Denver's Analysis of Fair Housing Impediment Study. As both of these indicators demonstrate a similar proportion, we've determined that 30% as the rationally related percentage for the policy. San Francisco used a percentage that was selected without data-driven rationale by their city council, and this yielded a further investigation by HUD. So to ensure the appropriateness of the scale, HOST believes it's important to maintain a data-driven standard, and this approach uses the best data available. There's going to be a marketing period for the prioritized units. The prioritization policy would apply for the first 14 days in which applications are taken. Property managers and sales teams must review the applicants who apply under the prioritization policy first to identify eligible applicants. If after 14 days, if no prioritized applicants are eligible, units could be leased or sold to residents without prioritization status. So the compliance. For affordable rental units, developers and property managers will be accountable for ultimately leasing units to prioritized households and would need to demonstrate that 30% of the units were occupied by prioritized households, and this will be measured and assessed at least every 3 years. For home ownership units, developers would need to demonstrate that 30% of their units were sold to prioritized households in initial sales. So how are you eligible for this policy? To be eligible for the program, applicants must have been displaced or at risk of displacement between 2000 and today, and or an applicant's family member was displaced from Denver between 1939 and 2000. The causes of displacement and vulnerability can be demonstrated by evidence of the rent or mortgage is more than 40% of the household income. A renter must move because the property owner is selling or has sold the unit, or they're moving into the rental unit. A no-cause eviction, an eviction for non-payment of rent, foreclosure, costly code violations, eminent domain, and red line neighborhoods. This is a slide with a lot of words on it. I'll go through it slowly and discuss why each of these points are here. Applicant priority would be determined on these conditions. So the first 3 points are really about longevity in Denver, and there's a possibility for 20 points here. So the first, the applicant is or was a Denver resident for 5 to 9 continuous years, that's 10 points. The applicant is or was a Denver resident for 10 to 14 continuous years, that's an additional 5 points. And the applicant is or was a Denver resident for 15 or more continuous years, that's an additional 5 points. Number 4 is the applicant was displaced or is at risk of displacement from a neighborhood where they have lived for at least 5 years, where an affordable housing development is being built. It's an additional 5 points. This is really focused on keeping folks in their neighborhood. So if affordable housing is being built in Globeville and someone currently lives in Globeville and they're at risk of displacement, they could get these additional points to move into a unit in that Globeville affordable housing development. Number 5, the applicant has generational ties to a neighborhood where their parent, grandparent, or primary guardian was displaced. This is an additional 5 points. So speaking to generational displacement, where families weren't able to stay in the neighborhoods of their choice, and hopefully bringing back future generations to Denver, to the neighborhood. The applicant is currently doubled up in housing or is experiencing homelessness. Kind of the ultimate form of displacement is displacement into very insecure housing or no housing at all. The applicant or member of the household has a disability. That's an additional 2 points. We know that individuals with disabilities are more likely to be displaced. And number 8, the applicant has children in the household eligible to be in Denver public schools. That's an additional 2 points. We know that large families are more likely to be displaced. And again, we really want to keep folks in their neighborhoods and in the schools where they are. So a few examples of how this would work. The first one, this couple is a Denver resident for 26 years. They live in a neighborhood where an affordable housing development is being built, and there's a disability in the household. They would receive 27 points. Number 2, they are a Denver resident for 5 years. They have generational ties to a neighborhood, and they have a disability. They would receive 17 points. And number 3, she's a Denver resident for 11 years. She's currently doubled up in housing, and she has children in school. She would receive 20 points. So the timeline. So we are here today for an info session, hoping to come back on August 17th for action. We're still putting together some of the stakeholder engagement pieces that we have been taking and working through some of those last details. So proposed city council action here in August of 2022. We are in an RFP process to build out that data system that will help us implement the policy and build out that affordable housing website that we were talking about at the beginning. We'll hopefully have we'll come to you for a contract for that. And we'll hopefully build out that system in 2023. And we're anticipating implementation of the policy once that data system is up and running in 2024. I did a lot of community engagement. Here is a list of all of the folks that I met with, either through one-on-one meetings or at stakeholder engagement meetings, a lot of community organizations, developers, pretty much a lot of folks that will be impacted by the policy one way or another. For the community engagement, I also engaged with other city departments, including NEST, the Mayor's Office of SEI, and Community Planning and Development. I held over 24 one-on-one meetings and briefings. I held a developer information session specifically for market rate developers for the mandatory housing that will be part of the policy. And I held 4 interactive stakeholder engagement meetings and 1 interactive community engagement meeting. We received a lot of feedback, and I've incorporated almost all of that feedback to date, and we're still working through incorporating some of the other pieces. Here's a list, and I'll just highlight some of the ones that we've been working on a long time. The marketing period for prioritized units. Some of you may remember this policy has been worked on for, I think, 4 years now. I'm very excited to be here to hopefully take it across the finish line, but marketing period is one of those pieces that we have had a lot of back and forth on, and we really feel like we've landed kind of in the middle for both community members and developers with that 14-day marketing period. We added eminent domain and red line neighborhoods to the factors for displacement. That was a piece of community feedback that we got. We added additional points for individuals experiencing homelessness in our point system. And we also added points for generational displacement, and those are kind of the big ones, but there's other pieces there as well that we're working on implementing or we already have. And with that, I would love your questions and comments.
Thank you, Polly, for the presentation. Before we get into questions, welcome Councilmember Sitibaka online, and we'll start with Councilmember Sawyer.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Polly. This is really exciting. I just had a question about the DPS piece.
Yes.
So we know that DPS has an extraordinary challenge, and they're a separate entity from the city, right? Want to be very clear about that for people that are watching. But we know that they are having an extraordinary challenge with graduation rates. Is it possible, or was it discussed within, community feedback to not necessarily tie the housing to graduation rate, but to a requirement of attendance at that DPS school?
Sure.
For 2 reasons. Number one, because there may be a situation where we find someone who qualifies for this program, but who also, potentially qualifies for scholarship or something, and so they choose not to go to DPS. So, and again, this is not I'm just asking the question, like there's a lot here. And second, if we're seeing people qualify for this and their children do qualify to go to a DPS school, but their children are not, their attendance rate is too low or something, is there a way that we can help support that challenge via this policy? Because it's a great policy and I'm super excited about it, but I do feel like there's opportunity to incentivize other outcomes that we also want in our city through this policy potentially. But I don't know what those legal implications look like, and I don't know what those barriers might look like, and I don't know what conversations there have been around it.
Yeah, so right now the wording is very deliberate on this point. The applicant has children in their household eligible to be in Denver Public Schools. So we got feedback from folks that we didn't want to specifically tie it to Denver Public Schools, specifically for individuals that are in the school for the deaf or the school for the blind, where those aren't DPS schools. But they're still in a neighborhood where a resident might be living, and we, again, know that large families are more likely to be displaced. So the points aren't necessarily for someone who is specifically in Denver Public Schools, but is eligible to be in Denver Public Schools. So I don't know, and we could talk more about it, about how, and I'm not sure, we do have Elliot here, I don't know if there are legal implications of...
And there might be, yeah. Right? I don't know, but I guess when I see this, there is an opportunity for us to kind of potentially help support our families in other outcomes that we would really like to see in our city. And I don't know, I guess I'm asking, could we do something like that, and would it be advisable or a good idea for us to do something like that, which are two totally different questions, right? Yeah. So thanks, really appreciate that. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And Polly, do you have staff online that might be waiting?
We do. We have Maureen, who's our Director of Compliance and Asset. If anyone has compliance questions with the policy, she's there. I'm not sure who else might be there.
Kalena Wong?
I'm sorry?
Kalena Wong? There's an attendee with their hand up. And
no,
okay.
I don't think so.
Thank you very much. Next up, Councilmember Kinich.
Thanks so much. Polly was talking about working on this for about 4 years, but this actually originated with City Council. We had a work group called the Housing and Homelessness Work Group, and Polly was the staff member from my office who supported that and did the original research, getting us on council excited about this policy. So it's really exciting for it to be here full circle. So for that reason, I've also been involved in it for 4 years, and I just want to close the loop on Councilwoman Sawyer's question. The way that I read the policy and the answer to the question is it already does what you asked. It is not tied to attendance of DPS, and it is not tied to graduation from DPS. It is only tied to the fact that you are eligible to attend. So I think the answer is it already does the thing that you asked it to do. But if there's more that I'm missing, I just wanted to, I think the loop is closed, that it does that. You don't have to be attending. You don't have to graduate. You just have to have been eligible to attend, which means living in the district, basically. That's the way DPS works. So does that help clarify?
Yeah, so yes, and thank you for that. I really appreciate it. I think the question is more, could we potentially, and is it advisable to, two different questions, do more with that requirement, right? So that, it would require a certain attendance level if your child attends DPS or something like that, right?
Okay, so I heard it the opposite. You want to make it a little harder to get the points.
I want to see if there's a way to use this policy to also help achieve some of the other outcomes that we are trying to achieve as a city, including higher graduation rates than what we currently see, higher attendance rates than what we currently see, and things like that.
Gotcha. Well, and I certainly will not speak for the agency at all on that. I would be a little hesitant to tie it to attendance just because if you're a family that's doing that couch surfing and doubling up, your kids are probably going to have poor attendance due to your housing instability. And then to penalize you or not give you the full points, right? And these are also just points. They don't guarantee you're going to get a unit. They don't come with any dollars attached to them. So they're pretty tenuous. So if I'm a person deciding whether my kid can make it to school today, I don't know, I would be thinking about this point system. If I'm aware of this point system, which I'm unlikely to be, and then would I be motivated to do something different? Those are questions I would ask, but I really appreciate just raising the question, and again, just responding for myself. I had wanted to chime in with just two quick clarification questions because, again, we're kind of doing an informational presentation today, and I've had the benefit of getting briefed on it previously. I think I know what you mean, but I just want to put it on the record. You mentioned 30% of units. But it's not 30% of units, for example, in a building. If that building is inclusionary or mandatory, I hate that we use that word mandatory. I didn't win that battle. It's an inclusionary housing policy. That's how most people in the world think of them. But if it's a building with 100 units, and for example, let's say that they chose a path where 12% of the units are affordable. That's 12 units. It's 30% of the affordable units that the policy covers. Is that right? It's not 30% of the units in the building.
Correct. It's affordable housing prioritization policy.
Right.
So for our mandatory units, it will be a percentage of a percentage, and we really get down into the nitty-gritty there, which is why we do have that minimum on mandatory buildings in non-areas vulnerable to displacement.
Got it. And I knew what you're talking about, but when we say the slide says 30% of units in qualifying developments, right? And so we probably want to just try to, again, for people who are going to be learning about this in the coming weeks, just as more basic, like 30% of affordable units or of the affordable units in a building, right? Or something like that might be making sure that people don't get their math squared. Very similar question on the scoring criteria. Again, this is so obvious, you probably didn't even think you need to put on a slide, but you don't just have to get these scores, you also have to have the income to meet the unit you're moving into. Is that right?
Correct. So we purposely did not put an AMI requirement in the policy specifically because our AMI levels are across the board for our housing. But for individuals who are applying for the policy, they will have to be income verified by the property to move in. So if it's a 50% AMI unit, they would have to be at 50% of AMI to move in.
Right. And I think it's just helpful for us that we might just want to say that. Residents need to qualify for the income of the unit and can receive points in these categories, especially because as we move to public awareness and advertising things, you know, we're dealing with folks who are literally seeing what's on the page. They haven't been here for this conversation, and so just the more we can kind of use this, every requirement someone has to meet should be mentioned every time so that no one feels surprised. Hey, I was displaced. I should qualify for this. And it's like, well, I'm sorry you were displaced, but you now earn 100% of median income, which means you're not going to be eligible for the homes we're talking about, right? So that type, we don't want to end up in those boats. So sorry for being super, you know, just want us to make sure that folks really understand something that's a little bit complicated. The next question is a little bit more of a sincere confusion question. And I wanted to just go back to the slide and look at it really quickly. Sorry, I lost track of my note on it. I am going to have to, I'm going to go back in the queue because I lost the slide that I wanted to ask my question on. So I'll pass Council Chair, and then I'll go back in the queue with my last question. Thank you.
We will get back to you. Councilmember Flynn.
Thank you. Polly, could you, this is the first detailed information I'm getting on this, and so I just want to make sure I understand, and Councilwoman Kinich, thank you, clarified a lot of questions, like what are the units that are going to be involved in the prioritization? And what I'm hearing is that these are the units that are within our existing program, but it would also now apply to units that are developed under our new ordinance that is going to require X percent depending on where it is and what it is. So how will, go over again please how they will be marketed, assigned, rented. Just go over that again a little bit. So we have a pool of units in a building, and 30% of that pool will be in this program. How do people find out about it? I think I heard you say that there will be a website of some sort that the operators of the managers of the units will post. What happens after that?
Yeah, so we are establishing, you all approved a budget that included $1 million for a data system. And that data system will have a public-facing website that will also have, it's kind of like an apartments.com type thing. So developers and property managers will post, folks will get notifications of units that they have said that they're interested in. So if someone's looking for a 2-bedroom unit, they can set up a notification that all 2-bedroom units be sent to them, and they'll be able to say, yes, I'm interested in that unit. Then they move forward, and they're kind of on this dynamic wait list based on their priority order, based on the scoring criteria. From there, there's 14 days in which those prioritized applicants have a stab at those 30% of units. So in a affordable building with 100 units, 30 units will be for the prioritization.
Sorry to interrupt, but so during that 14-day period, the management cannot lease that unit to someone who is not
Correct.
Okay.
Yep, there's
I'm sorry, go ahead.
14 days for folks to say, hey, I'm interested in this, and they'll be on that dynamic wait list.
Right.
At the end of those 14 days, then the developer or property manager can start their own application process. We're hoping that the data system will have kind of a common application in which people can put their income, so they know what AMI level they're at, to try to narrow down folks for that particular unit. And that matches their qualifications. And then they'll get that list at the end to go through. And the goal is to find a approved applicant through the developer property manager's system to get a prioritized applicant into the unit, and hoping to make it as seamless and easy as possible.
So I'm a very visual person, so I'm trying to visualize it in my brain, that what I'm hearing is 100% of the affordable units in a project, that anytime any of those comes up, this 2-week period applies, even though only 30% of that 100% of the units is in this program. So until that 30% threshold is met, any unit, in other words, it's not 30% of, they don't designate 30% of the units. They can't say, well, this isn't one of those 30%. This is one of the others. It's all of them until they meet the 30%.
Correct.
Thank you. That's very
correct. Yeah, the units float.
Yes.
Until they hit that 30% threshold, they'll continue to market for 14 days. And then anytime a prioritized unit comes up for a vacancy, that particular unit to stay in the 30% compliance.
So once they meet that goal and they're at 100% occupancy, when someone moves out, moves to another place, and that unit becomes available, that would have to follow the same process.
Correct.
Okay.
If they're going under that 30%. So
what resources does Host bring to bear to assist these households with meeting their rent obligations? Will we have vouchers? Will we have other resources to help them meet the rents that are required?
I'm looking to Jennifer. Do you want to take that?
Hello, everyone. I'm Jennifer, Vice Director of Data Policy and Strategy for Host. It's nice to be here with you all this afternoon. And so with households that are matched to affordable housing through the prioritization policy would, of course, be eligible for any other Host programs that we would offer. So that would include things like our tenant rent and utility assistance, or currently emergency rental assistance program through our COVID recovery dollars if they were to get behind on rent and qualify for those resources. And we are also in our strategic plan really looking to how we're outreaching households about those resources that are available. So we're really getting the word out to folks about all of the things that they can benefit from. So those are just a couple of examples, but part of our plan is to do more of that work and also make sure we're connecting folks to that, which would include folks in these prioritized units.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One other question, Polly, the generational category of points back to 1939. I'm thinking of the west side. I'm thinking Westwood, for instance. Westwood was once its own municipality before Denver took it over and annexed it in the late 40s, mid 40s. And so if somebody comes along and says, you know what, my granddad and grandma, they lost their house just off Morrison Road during the war. How do we possibly document something like that? I mean, it's good that we're looking into that. I'm just wondering, I would bet that a lot of families will have difficulty documenting that or making the case.
Yeah, so we are keeping the barrier to entry as low as possible with still doing checks and balances. So for our displacement qualifications, the two things that folks need to provide tangible evidence for is the address in which they lived. And we have adopted a list from Seattle, which is the most comprehensive list of how you can prove your address. It includes food bank records, obituaries, a whole host of different ways to prove the address.
This sounds like a genealogical search. the Western History Department at the DPL ought to be able to help with that.
Yeah.
Old crisscross city directories, things like that. It's pretty
Yeah.
amazing what you can actually find.
Yeah. So the proof of address, and then you need to prove that you're vulnerable to displacement or that you have been displaced. To prove that, though, it could be as simple as a neighbor or a non-familial contact saying yes, like I lived next to their grandpa, that their neighbor is still alive. They were displaced, and I certify that this is allowable. So kind of a certification form to say, of someone who's not necessarily related to you, to say, yes, this person is displaced, and another, I can certify that my neighbor is being displaced because the owner of their building has moved in.
Right.
So those are the two tangible pieces of evidence that we're asking for. Otherwise, it'll be self-attestation, and you'll check a box, and we'll have the good lawyer language of, self-certify based on, all the facts that you know to be true.
And they would do this not in that 2-week time frame, would they? They would do this ahead of time, and they'd be enrolled.
Pre-qualified, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, we'll have our compliance team reviewing applications on a rolling basis. We anticipate probably getting a big influx of applications in the beginning of the program once it launches, and then being able to scale down and have someone just routinely going through those applications and verifying.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's interesting. I opened the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, and I saw a photograph of the house that my great-grandparents built back in the Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania. It was a story about my hometown and how it was becoming popular because it was the first city in Pennsylvania you reached after you leave Times Square through the Lincoln Tunnel. And they lost it during the Great Depression. And our family could document that. So I have no doubt that we'll have a lot of families here in Denver who were similarly situated, not just during the Depression, because we don't go back, we're starting in 1939. But I imagine we have a lot of families whose family histories would be able to document that. That's very nice. Thank you. I appreciate that. That's all, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councilmember Kniech, you're back up.
Thanks so much. Just one quick follow-up to Councilman Flynn's question. So you have to prove that you had the address. You don't necessarily have to prove the circumstances by which the home was lost or what the ancestor, right?
Correct.
So if you're currently being evicted, you'd have to prove that. If you're currently at risk of, you have a disability. So if you have a current condition, you have to prove the condition. But for the historical stuff, it's just you have to prove the address.
Prove the address, and the address is for current as well.
Right.
So if you are currently living in Denver, you lived in Denver 5 years ago and were displaced, you would have to show that address. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you for clarifying that.
Mr. Chair, in other words, if I could, in other words, you're saying it's not necessary for the historical generational category of qualification to prove that there was some circumstance that forced you out, only that you had historical ties to that neighborhood. Is that?
Correct. So, for example, if your parents lost it your grandparents lost it in a foreclosure, I don't think you'd have to provide proof that it was lost in a foreclosure in the 50s.
Right. Correct.
Thank you.
Correct.
Yeah. Makes it a less of a burden. So, and I think that, if you think about it, if you kind of relax from the details and just sit back for a second, this is about ties and place, right? That's what it's about, right? It's about, our affordability program has always been about income. This is about being able to have a choice of choosing the place that you have ties to, right? So you don't have to, if you think about it, the circumstances are less relevant to why we left. We have a lot of data globally that the policy is based on where displacement trends have occurred. Okay, so I found the slide and it didn't have a number on it. So it's titled Affordable Rental Units and it's underlined. So whichever number slide that is. So I think in my brain, I just wanted to have us all be really clear on which buildings are in and which buildings are out. So maybe a side-by-side list might be helpful. So I'm just gonna say my understanding, you tell me if I'm right maybe. So no existing building will be covered by this policy. Only buildings newly built after it's passed. Is that correct?
It is correct, with the caveat that newly preserved units will be encompassed into the policy. So units that are preserved, that have new funding going into them, they will be included. We will have to work in rules and regs to figure out when they have to come into compliance, because we don't want to displace the resident that is living in that newly preserved unit. But newly preserved units will be included. But no, a unit that's being built today that's affordable will not apply to the policy.
Gotcha. And was that, without getting into the legal details, was there a legal reason we felt like we couldn't apply it to existing buildings? It's a lot of housing stock that won't be under the policy. Have any other cities done existing affordable units, or did we do a legal analysis of that? Or
I'll ask Elliot to come up for because I asked him this question. Other cities do not. They do take a forward-looking approach, and Elliot can speak to more the legal parameters for that.
Gotcha.
Good morning, Council. Elliot Schaefer, Assistant City Attorney. To answer your question, yes, there are legal issues, and as far as Polly indicated, I am not familiar or aware of any other city retroactively applying a prioritization policy to existing affordable units.
Got it. It makes sense to me, but we as council members will get the question. And so it's important for us to be able to answer that it was considered and evaluated and determined not possible. So thank you. All right, so Polly, I'm going to keep walking through the list then. So if a building has our money in it, because it's a 100% affordable building, it's a tax credit project, and we've given them $1 million or $2 million in what we call gap financing, this policy will apply regardless of where in the city it occurs.
Correct.
All right. And the residents who will be prioritized for it, some of the points are citywide. But will the residents prioritized for a building, let's say in Wash Park, is there any geographic, they would have expressed an interest in that area, or would they have to have lived within a vicinity of it? Is there any geographical connection between where a building is and where the applicant is?
Sure. So you get additional points if you're in a neighborhood where affordable housing is being built. So I'll use your example for Wash Park. If there's affordable housing being built in Wash Park, someone lives in Wash Park and they're vulnerable to displacement, they will get 5 additional points to kind of bump them up on the list to get into those units. It does not mean that that person in Wash Park rises to the top of the list, but it does give them additional points, and depending on where they fall elsewhere in the scoring criteria, they could move higher. But someone who maybe is living in Westwood, they could also apply to live in that Wash Park unit, and they may have more points based on longevity or other factors. So they could go to that Wash Park unit as well.
And they wouldn't get put in it against their will. If they got the little ping on their phone that said you're eligible for this unit, they could say, nah, I don't, or no, hey, there's great schools in that neighborhood, and I've always wanted to live near that beautiful park, and yes, I would like to try for that unit. Yeah. They would choose.
Yes, exactly.
Great. All right, so building we put money into gets, is under the policy no matter where it is. Okay. And then with this middle bullet, the mandatory housing bullet, this one is, just to put my own words in it, large buildings or any building in an area vulnerable to displacement. Is that right? Correct. So what is not covered, if it is a 20-unit apartment complex and it's in Wash Park, it would not be subject to the policy.
Correct. Okay,
so there's an in for that, but there's also a group that's out, which is a unit is buildings 99 units or less. And do you want to say anything about that particular decision that you guys made?
Yeah, it's a multifaceted decision. One being compliance being the biggest piece of it. Because we're talking about percentages of percentages, tracking one unit across the city gets really hard. And we want to ensure that we have a policy that we can enforce and is effective. And so we put that 100-unit cap on most places of the city. But again, to try to ease the burden of displacement in our areas vulnerable to displacement, any size building in those particular areas.
And I'll just use the same math I used for my prior question, because I think what you've said makes sense. So if I'm a 100-unit building and I'm under the EHA policy, if I built 8% of my units as 60% of AMI, that would be the minimum requirement. I would have 8 units, a third of which would be subject to this policy, which we'd probably round up and say 3. Yep. So we already have a very small number of units to track here. So I agree with your math, but just to play out what it would be, if you had a 50-unit building, we'd be at that 1 unit. Yep. So I totally hear you.
And we are rounding up. We have round up rules in the ordinance.
Okay. So yeah, so for 8 units, a third would be 3, not 2.3. Right. Okay. Super. The other thing I wanted to ask you is, you mentioned Seattle in passing and San Francisco in passing. This is not a brand new policy to the country, but we're probably innovating. Do you want to just talk about the fact of how you've researched lessons learned from elsewhere? Because I think you've done a lot of that work, and it might be interesting for people to know that we've tried to look at those best practices.
Yeah, we spent the most time looking at San Francisco. They're the only other community with an ordinance, and we're hoping to pass an ordinance with this policy. Also looked at Seattle, Portland, and Austin, which all have programs. Some of those programs are voluntary, some of them are more mandatory in their policy, but again, San Francisco is the only one with an ordinance. We definitely looked at best practices that the other cities were doing. Portland's is kind of an urban renewal where people can come back to an area, which we took for the generational displacement. But also, we've really created our own policy that's going to benefit Denver, and have Denver residents be brought up in it. So definitely looked at best practices around the country, mostly our western cities. But we've really crafted a policy that's going to benefit Denver in the best way possible.
Great. Well, thanks so much. I will just say one community I think about when I think about this policy is Auraria, right? The historical displacement. And it's interesting because, there was a generational cutoff at first for those who were displaced Aurarians and being able to get free tuition. And I believe I heard a couple weeks ago that they're removing that, which is any descendant of a displaced Aurarian will be able to get free tuition at, I forget if it was Metro State or I forget which campus had it particularly, but it makes me think about, examples of where we've had that kind of mass displacement, as well as what we have now, which is economic displacement. So thanks very much. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councilman Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Polly, could you, the memo on this that went out back in March says that we've looked at peer cities, and Councilwoman Kinich just mentioned a few. Of the cities that have this policy, and it might be slightly different than what we're proposing here, have there been any analyses done on the results? And can you share that with us?
I don't think San Francisco's has been in place the longest, and I can tell you the full transparency, the greatest criticism is there's not enough affordable housing being built for the policy to apply to. When the policy is applied, it's very successful in those communities, and it has been bringing folks back to neighborhoods and keeping them in neighborhoods, specifically in San Francisco, where it has been around the longest.
Are there any papers on this that we could read?
Not that I have found.
Boy, it sure would be good to have some of that. Will you continue looking?
I will continue looking.
Thank you. Because I'd like to see, has this actually worked? It sounds like anecdotally in San Francisco, you're saying there's evidence that it has, but it would be nice to see it sort of a rigorous analysis of how it's worked. Is it bringing people back? Because that would be wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Just give another second. Looks like we're all filled up with questions. Thank you very much.
I had one more. I think I got removed. Sorry.
Just late to the buzzer. Way to go.
I know. Check me out, right?
Go ahead.
I did just want to ask you, since this is a briefing and there's potential changes that could possibly be made, recognizing that there have been challenges in San Francisco with simply not enough affordable housing being built for this apply to at the 30% level. Did you look at the possibility of raising the percentage in order to, because this is our most vulnerable population. This is a population of people that we really want to make sure that we really want to make sure we're supporting all of our residents, that this is on the principles of equity, this is our kind of real focused population. So would it be better for it to apply to 50% or 75%, or is that possible? I just want to make sure that we're instituting a policy that's actually going to create change, as opposed to just simply not having enough of the housing affordability built for the percentage of a percentage to really make a valuable difference in those neighborhoods.
Sure. So like I said on my long legalese slide about 30%, it needs to be rationally related to the incidence of involuntary displacement. San Francisco, they picked 40% kind of out of thin air, and then they were investigated by HUD. We don't want that. So 30% is where we feel most comfortable sticking with.
So that investigation by HUD, what was the outcome of that? The reason I'm asking is because if San Francisco was able to prove that 40% worked, let's go to 40%, right?
Yeah.
Because we have the ability, we have that precedent set. So I'm just curious if you know.
Yeah, I don't know if we actually know the outcome of that investigation. I don't think San Francisco's still at 40% though. I think they dropped down in percentage, and I can look further into that and get an answer back to you on what happened, and when an investigation started, if they then said, okay, we'll just
change it in order to halt the investigation to a number that seems to appear more or can be backed up by data in some way based on the demographics of the city. Okay, that's really good to know. Thanks, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Okay, now I'm done, sorry.
It's quite all right. We have a repeat from our friend down at the far left, from the far right to the far left.
Recidivism from this end. I think that I was going to go back to Councilman Flynn's question first, but I also want to respond to Councilman Sawyer's. This policy is pretty innovative, and we have a hard time getting academic research on even policies that have been around for a really long time, and so I think that's why there's not a lot of studies, because it's pretty innovative. It is in some ways like inclusionary. This is a forward-looking policy. It's going to take a very long time, since it can only apply to our inclusionary policy will not show fruit for a decade because it applies to new development. This policy will not provide fruit for a decade because it applies to new development, right? But it is important to have on the books because there's no evidence that the trends and the pressures that urban communities are facing with affordability are going to go away in less than a decade, or, I don't know. I mean, we'll see whether there's a back to the suburbs movement in 30 years and our cities hollow out. But I hope that's not the case. The trend has not been in that direction in terms of transportation and jobs and all the things that bring people to cities. So I do think that this is really exciting, but it is also a forward policy. It is one way, and I think in particular tied with the inclusionary bill, that makes that policy have a more equitable outlook than it does when you just look at it by itself. We knew this policy was coming when we passed EHA, or expanding housing affordability, or mandatory housing, whatever. We have a naming problem in the city. But whatever that policy is called, we knew this policy was coming. And for me personally, I would not have supported that policy if I hadn't known this was coming on its heels, because it's designed to work together with that new development to deliver on the equity outcomes over time. But it is a long horizon. The other piece I just wanted to say about the percentage is it's also similar in some ways to the inclusionary policy. Would we like would we like 50% or 60% of units to be set aside as affordable, or would we like 50 or 60% of units to be set aside? In this case, there's actually not just a legal reason, there's a values reason why we might want to keep it to this proportion, which is we want to keep racially integrated and diverse communities. Let's go back to my Wash Park example. If I have a Wash Park example, we know that the demographics are a little bit less racially diverse. If I give prioritization points to folks that are closest to that area, and that's for all the affordable units, then you might end up with a certain demographic trend that might be harder, for example, for Latino or African American residents. So this policy is written in a way that really balances the desire to get folks vulnerable to displacement, prioritize to stay in their neighborhood, but also only for a portion of units, so that the remaining units are available to a fully racially diverse and geographically diverse group of people, because we, as historically, when we give preference to folks, we run that risk of everybody looking the same. And that's not the way we want our housing world to work, right? Redlining caused all that harm, and we're still trying to undo that. So, this is so tricky because, redlining created segregation, which was harmful, and it was followed by disinvestment. But the resilience of those communities is that they created strong identities. And now they want to stay intact. And the very same laws that, make discrimination illegal make it hard for them to say, only people who are like me should live in this neighborhood, because we want to stay intact. We want to keep our carniceria and our tortilleria because we want to have enough Latino families to support those businesses. So I think that it's a good thing that it's a portion of units, because it means that they continue to be available, meeting both the spirit as well as the details of the law that they've all been navigating as they wrote this. So it's really hard to talk about with community, but when I've been able to give that whole history of why we don't just set aside all the units, folks, I think, start to understand what we're trying to balance here. But it takes a while to explain, as you just heard. So anyway, I think while I might personally wish we had more units faster and personally wish that we could have a higher percentage, I think that the values and the legal things that you're operating within, this is a really strong policy. So I'm really excited about that. Thanks.
All right, thank you. We'll take a couple minutes to wait to see if there's any more jump in. All right, seeing none, again, thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you for a most innovative policy. Really exciting that we're leading the way in this area, and it's much needed. With that, seeing nothing further on our agenda, this meeting is adjourned. Come back to council often, please.
I will.